And joining us now for the first of 5 programs all week long here on the agenda to talk China's growth, wealth, and power. There's Janice Stein from the Munk School of Global Affairs. Welcome back, Janice.
Pleasure, Steve.
Lovely to have you here all week long. We're going to talk all sorts of different things about China, starting today with economic growth. I want to take you back more than 3 decades. Deng Xiaoping ushering in what he called the second revolution of China, beginning a process of reforming the country's economic system, called it socialism with Chinese characteristics. As we take a step back before we look to the present and the future, what were those characteristics that he was talking about?
He's absolutely right, Steve. He was probably the greatest figure in the second half of the 20th century in China. He opened the Chinese economy to international trade, to manufacturing, even to some international investment, while absolutely maintaining the control of the Chinese Communist Party. He did it by creating, at the beginning, economic zones on the coastal areas of China, where factories sprung up. This was the beginning of this unbelievable story of Chinese economic success.
And just one more follow-up on this before we talk some numbers. How did he say to the world with a straight face, this is still communism?
That's a good one. It's interesting. I think probably in his own mind he could say this because the central role of the Chinese Communist Party in Chinese society was still maintained. It was very much in contrast to what was happening in the then Soviet Union under Gorbachev, who did the reverse, who opened up to politics but never really had a feel for economics. Deng Xiaoping was exactly the reverse. Tight, rigid control by the Chinese Communist Party, which still continues to this day in China.
Of the political system.
Of the political system, but opened the economy to investment and decided really that China would become the low-value manufacturer of the world. Capitalist manufacturer of the world.
Let me read this from the World Bank here. These numbers are nothing short of astonishing. Yep, between 1981 and 2004, the fraction of the Chinese population consuming less than $1 a day fell from 65% to 10%, and more than 500 million people were lifted out of poverty. When you think about economic achievement from the beginning of time on this planet, how does that rank?
Probably among the greatest, in all honesty, in this sense that this is a very short period of time, really. 2.5 decades. Yeah, those numbers are actually 1981 to 2004, 23 years to lift 500 million people out of poverty. The Industrial Revolution in Britain didn't do that, in England didn't do that in that period of time. So what the Chinese did really was telescope history. And given the large numbers in China, what the Chinese government did lifted more people out of poverty more quickly than all the development assistance in the world. It's really stunning.
Maybe the singular economic achievement, certainly of our time, but maybe of any time.
It is. It is. It's striking.
What has it meant for the people of China to have experienced this?
You know, and it's actually interesting when you go to China and you talk to some families whose parents still remember the Cultural Revolution, which was the last great spasm under Mao, where he totally disrupted the economy, sent people out to the countryside, people were imprisoned, and they're killed. And their children are the ones who've now benefited from this astonishing economic success. So within the span, literally, of one generation, young people in China can afford to go into a Starbucks, have jobs.
But stop there. The fact they even have Starbucks.
It's astonishing.
That's different, too.
It's absolutely astonishing. Own their own apartments, right? In a country that 30 years ago, all land was collectively owned. There are now rings and rings and rings of condominium apartments. They're not called that, but effectively you do own your own apartment in the large cities in China. It is literally a 360-degree turn within the span of one generation in a family. Often the parents can't really communicate with their children. The life is so dramatically different.
And Deng Xiaoping started it all.
Yeah, and you see it in the cities. That's in fact where this economic revolution has taken place. The countryside, the rural part of China, still feels a lot like it did.
Hold that thought. We're going to get to that in a second. I want to read something here from the China Daily that was published earlier in the spring. China expects its economy to grow around 8% in the year 2010 from a year earlier, says a report to be delivered by Premier Wen Jiabao at the annual Parliament session Friday, March 5th. Setting the 8% target mainly, quote, aims at ensuring the quality of economic growth, focusing on transformation of economic development pattern and adjustment of economic structure. That sounds very, right? That's
Good
how
Chinese
they talk.
language.
Yeah, that's
Good
how they
Chinese
talk.
language.
What's missing from this, though, is a belief, I guess, among senior Chinese officials that 8% growth is also needed to maintain social peace. How so?
Well, that's absolutely right. And there's actually two things missing from that quote, okay? One is that the Chinese economy has to, by the analysis of Chinese economists, not outsiders, not Westerners, has to create between 10 and 12 million new jobs in order to absorb the demands of young people coming into the labor market.
This is every year.
Every year, that's right. So if the Chinese economy doesn't grow by 8 to 10% a year, you have problems and you have social unrest. And that is occurring constantly, both in the Chinese cities and even in the countryside. We just don't hear a lot about it. So it's a very thin edge of the wedge. The other thing that Chinese economists talk about is China can no longer, and is no longer, frankly, the manufacturing, the factory of the world at the bottom end. It's moving up the value chain to better and better jobs with higher and higher salaries. So it's got to do two things at the same time, right? It's got to transform its economy and move up the ladder and export those lower paying jobs to others at the same time as it continues to produce this astonishing number of jobs for new people coming in into the labor markets. It's a real challenge.
Does it seem from your read of it that they're doing that, though?
Currently they are, and if anything, they've exceeded that number, 8%. The IMF just released figures for the first quarter of 2010, and their growth is over 10% this year, the fastest growing economy in the world by far. They've moved to become the world's largest exporter. They've surpassed Germany and the United States. Their stock markets in communist China, the stock markets, are among the fastest rising. They have a real estate bubble. So that economy, at the same time as Europe and the United States is struggling, the Chinese economy is on a tear.
Well, but I can see people in Europe and the United States saying, well, sure, but we could do that too if we ran a police state. I guess this little business of democracy makes it a little more complicated,
well,
doesn't it?
That's an interesting argument, Steve, because in the past, if you look at the Russian experience, it was the police state that fundamentally got in the way of a modern economy. It was because the Russians could never loosen up enough so that you could have advanced computer sector, advanced information processing, all the things that you needed to move into the post-industrial stage. What's so interesting about the Chinese, and that's the big puzzle, is they maintain this iron grip. Human rights are as much at risk as they ever were in China, but really first-rate industrial performance, a lead in certain parts of the computer sector, the world's strongest producer of lithium batteries, which is the future for green tech. So the Chinese, in a sense, have somehow thus far managed to do all this despite being a police state.
And all those things you mentioned are themes actually we're going to explore throughout the week. But at the moment, I want to pick up on something you said a few moments ago about this move from the countryside to the cities. 200 million rural workers have gone from the countryside into the cities. How has this contributed to the country's growth?
It's a crucial part. The bigger picture for China over the longer run, not the next 5 years, but moving out from 2015, as astonishing as this is too, China will face a labor shortage.
That sounds impossible in a country of 1 billion people, more than 1 billion.
When people hear that, they kind of sit up and they say, how is that possible? But it is, in a sense, very close to facing a labor shortage right now. And the plan that the Chinese government has to postpone that, not to solve the problem, And as you move further out to 20 to 25, it gets worse and worse. But the plan is to move another 300 to 400 million people from the countryside into the cities, and to hope that agriculture will become as efficient as it is, for example, in the United States.
But if they're moving to a higher end economy where they're no longer satisfied being the producers of all the, forgive me, crap that they like to export to the West, presumably that's going to have a negative impact on the rural poor who do not have the skills necessary to make those newer, more high-tech components. Is that not right?
Well, you're right. And so that's one of the many crunches that the Chinese economy will face over the next decade, decade and a half. What the Chinese are doing about that is a massive investment in higher education, in university sectors. They're spending more as a proportion of their GDP than any other country in the world on higher education. And to give you only one statistic, Steve, they are graduating 100 PhDs in computer science for every one in the United States. They know that they have to have an educated labor force.
Okay, but the education can't be as good as what you get in the United States.
No, the United States.
So does the 100 equal the 1?
Well, it doesn't now, but at some point you have to say to yourself, at some point, will quantity become quality? This isn't, again, everything about China is, because of the massive scope, it's unprecedented. We've never seen an investment in higher education of this order of magnitude in this short period of time.
One thing we've also, I think, never seen, not like it is today, is a restlessness among this burgeoning middle class that is not satisfied with the amount of economic growth they have experienced, and they want more political say. And I mean, the suicides of the past, few months, maybe the tip of the iceberg. That's quite shocking, wasn't it?
Let's separate out those two things, because what you're seeing now and I don't think it's so much that the labor unrest that is happening in China is new. It's been there. What you are seeing is it's being reported, and it's being reported by the Chinese press, so we're aware of it. So that's very interesting in itself. There's actually some criticism of the official single Chinese labor union. There's only one, and actually the labor union is an instrument of the government rather than an instrument of labor, as we would think about it in this part of the world. But the demand is for higher wages. The demand is for better working conditions because environmental issues are huge, health hazards are huge. There's almost we're not hearing in the Chinese press any demand for greater political participation. So it's all
among workers.
Among workers. That's not getting reported in the Chinese press at all.
But it is happening.
Unclear. Again,
okay.
Right? If we talk to individual Chinese, it's not coming so much from people who are working in factories. It's coming from all the usual places, from the university sector, from students, from that part of the chattering classes. But those who are working in factories are heavily focused on improving economic and health conditions in factories. And
in our last minute here, do you see Beijing contemplating any reforms that would address what seems to be an increasingly urgent situation?
And this is something we might want to come back to when we talk about China's role in the global economy. The way the Chinese are thinking about it right now, salaries go up. That is a benefit to China because you improve the quality of your labor force, easier to move up the chain. Will also make Chinese exports more expensive and will begin to address some of the global imbalance that the United States and the Europeans keep talking about.
You're quite right. We're going to come back to all these themes throughout the week. So Janice, thank you very much for getting the table set today, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
Great.